Hi, I'm going to talk to you about open source firmware, what it is and why you might want it. If you own a computer and you hear about a new exploit in UEFI, should you be worried? Is your computer collecting your passwords or private information and sending it to somebody? What about your internet router? Is it watching every site you go to? How would you even know? We have hundreds of devices in our lives and we rely on them to do what we want and be secure. But are they? The first thing a device does when it starts up is to run the firmware. For a criminal, the easiest way to attack a device is often through its firmware, before the OS even runs. There are not that many operating systems in the world. There's Android, iOS, Windows, Linux are the major ones. But firmware is highly fragmented. There are lots and lots of different pieces. In fact, it's a little bit like a plate of spaghetti, although somewhat less tasty. There are lots of pieces. A problem in any of these pieces could provide an opportunity for a criminal to break in. Also, firmware is pretty opaque. Do you know what firmware your device runs? If you have a Windows PC, it's probably UEFI, a large and complex piece of software. But every vendor adds their own bits and pieces to the firmware and they don't share the code. Most are more worried about shipping the product with the required features than making it secure. New vulnerabilities are discovered regularly, and with all this complexity, I'm sure there are many we don't know about. So how does open source firmware help with all of these problems? You may be familiar with Linux, which runs most of the internet. Linux is open source, which means that the source code is developed collaboratively and in the open. There are contributions from hundreds of companies, including Intel, Microsoft, AMD, Oracle, Amazon, Apple, and ARM. Security researchers can look at the code and see if they can find problems with it. They publish their results for everybody to see. It's the same with open source firmware. It is like shining a light on your firmware. It becomes more transparent, making it possible to look at what's inside the firmware, checking whether there are known bugs or vulnerabilities which might affect you. Open source firmware improves security, but it's also more flexible so that it is easier for people to integrate it into their product. As our devices become more and more complex, open source firmware has many advantages.